A thought-terminating cliché is a word or phrase that's used for the purpose of ending a line of thought or discussion. It's shorthand for an understood meaning, or sometimes a misunderstood meaning, that's used to terminate further thought or discussion on a topic. It could be a phrase like, "Well, that's just your opinion," which is used to suggest either that all opinions are equally worthless, or that one opinion has no more value than any other. Or it could be a singular term, like communist. Quite frequently, communist is a shorthand term for something bad. Typically, people who label things as communist want it to be understood that this thing is something harmful, something threatening, something unpleasant, and therefore requires no further discussion. It's rarely used to broach discussions about communism itself, its merits or failures, how it's been applied in different countries. And when the topic of North Korea comes up, it's easy to dismiss it by saying North Korea is communist. After all, North Korea is communist because North Korea is bad, and North Korea is bad because communism is bad. But is North Korea communist? Recently, I made a video encouraging people to stop talking about North Korea, if only because the talk about North Korea is always of such a limited nature, because it's always pretty much just about the threat of North Korea. This usually boils down to three main aspects. North Korea is an authoritarian dictatorship, which is true. North Korea possesses nuclear weapons, or is at least trying to develop nuclear weapons, which is true. And North Korea is communist. But is that true? This video isn't a defense or indictment of communism, or even a discussion about what it is. The only thing I want to do here is examine whether or not North Korea is communist. And more importantly, what would it mean if it were? And what does it mean if it's not? When we use communist as a thought-terminating cliché to describe North Korea, what exactly are we overlooking? Point 1. When Karl Marx sought to define communism, he said, "Workers of the world unite." He was emphasizing and prioritizing class struggle over nationality or ethnicity. And the thing here is that North Korea doesn't really care about what's going on in the rest of the world. Even if we were to grant that North Korea is a classless society today, which it's not, it's certainly not trying to unite in a struggle with workers anywhere else in the world. Its extreme isolationism is pretty much antithetical to the things Marx was talking about. Marx didn't say, "Seize the means of production and then let one dynastic family and its inner circle hoard all of the wealth and resources for the next 7 decades. Point 2. According to Marx, one of the biggest requirements for a state to become communist rather than socialist is that it must have a revolution to overthrow capitalism. Did North Korea have a revolution, and did they overthrow capitalism? North Korea claims to have had its revolution in 1948, when the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the official name of North Korea, was formally established, and then shortly after this was followed by the Korean War. But does this count as a revolution? 3 years prior to this, Korea was liberated from occupation by Japan. The Japanese were clearly oppressors, but that seems like the time when a revolution would have been necessary. North Korea's revolution occurred after they were freed from Japan. It was a period during which there was no official Korean government or even a constitution. And moreover, if someone wants to characterize the Korean War as the revolution, it was more a proxy war for the USSR and the United States, and also China. It was a manifestation of the Cold War, but it wasn't really a war of revolution for the Koreas. In any case, I don't think this was the revolution that Marx had in mind. Point 3. Kim Il-sung, the founder and first leader of North Korea, was probably actually communist. He was trained in the USSR and fought in the Soviet Red Army. He was also installed as the leader of what became North Korea by Stalin himself. His way of governing and ruling was very Stalinist in that he developed a cult of personality, and he quickly established a police state and a dictatorship. A dictatorship is not very Marxist at all. The whole point of the Marxist communist revolution was to abolish the state. A truly communist society would have no more need for the state. It would no longer need to coerce individuals. And the coercive nature of a dictatorship is antithetical to communism. Point 4. Rather than adopt socialism and communism as a state ideology, Kim Il-sung quickly established the Juche ideology. It was obviously influenced by Marxist and communist ideals, but it quickly shifted away from them. It not only prioritized national independence, but it placed tremendous value on ethnic identity and blood. Essentially, one's identity as a North Korean citizen was indistinguishable from one's North Korean heritage. And that's obviously not about workers of the world, world, that's not even about workers. In fact, even Stalin was against nationalism. And also at this time, North Korea promoted bringing back its old cultural traditions in order to bolster this sort of nationalist sentiment. And then you got things like in the 1960s, the North Korean state urged anyone married to a European to divorce. And much more recently, in the 21st century, North Korean women who were found to be pregnant by Chinese men were forced to get abortions. This obsession with blood and nationalist identity has very little to do with communism. One could even look at it as an inversion of what Hitler was trying to accomplish. Whereas North Korea is, at the time of its founding, quote-unquote pure. So instead of going around purging anyone, it closes its borders, which also kind of makes it not very good at fascism, or else it would go around invading other countries. Now, experts contend that these days North Korea no longer really adheres to Juche ideology, that it's more a propaganda line for the international community. North Korea is more about its Sungun ideology, which is about prioritizing the strength of its military, and basically considering the military equivalent with the state. Not only is this not communist or fascist, it's not really commensurate with any other ideology. Point 5. North Korea hasn't even considered itself to be communist. Back at the founding of the country, its main party was called the Workers' Party of Korea. That kind of sounds pretty communist, doesn't it? The thing is that the Workers' Party of Korea has effectively been North Korea's only political party, because the other tiny minority parties are likely only there for show. Essentially, the name Workers' Party of Korea has about as much meaning as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, which, let me remind you, is neither democratic nor a republic. And over the years, North Korea has gone out of its way to purge any references to communist ideology in its constitution and in its Juche manifesto. Now, one could say, well, North Korea lies about its name in being the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Why couldn't they also lie about not being communist? Well, what's the point of pretending not to be communist if you're actually communist? It's not like North Korea is particularly interested in presenting a positive image to the rest of the world. I'm simply pointing out that in addition to not having features of communism, they don't even consider themselves to be communist. Point 6. There are still many parallels in North Korean society to the USSR. There's the hammer and sickle imagery. There's the association with the color red. There's the fact that their relationship to South Korea sort of parallels the Cold War relationships. But these are all superficial features. They are emblematic of things we associate with a communist country, but they do not demonstrate that a country is actually communist. Now, to be fair, it's not just the rest of the world that perceives North Korea as communist. The loudest accusations tend to come from South Korea's, particularly conservative South Koreans, particularly the older generation who may have been around during the Korean War. Because at that time, their country was literally invaded by communists. The problem is that over time, things have changed, and what resemblance North Korea had to communism back then doesn't really hold much water today, and correspondingly, our analysis of North Korea should change too. Ultimately, what does it matter whether or not North Korea is communist? Because referring to it as communist doesn't actually tell us anything about the way it is today. It doesn't explain why the North Korean regime behaves the way it behaves. It doesn't tell us anything about what its international goals are. It doesn't explain its isolationism, and it doesn't explain its strained relationships with the rest of the world. And it's not that the label is useless because it doesn't convey any of this information. It's because of all this information that makes the label useless. Some experts in North Korea consider it to be post-ideological today. North Korea is to some extent just a gangster state, where the people in power are just trying to retain power. They can keep indulging themselves with the luxuries they can afford and that they can steal and that they can exploit from the goodwill of other countries and which they can exploit from their own people. As long as they can maintain this balance of exploitation and subjugation, everything remains stable for them. It's not a great way to rule a country, unless I guess you happen to be the ruler. It just doesn't really make sense in terms of any other political structure or ideology. So remember our list back at the beginning? It's already bad enough that North Korea is an authoritarian dictatorship and that they have or are pursuing nuclear weapons. These are good enough reasons to criticize them. And if you really want a useful label to express how bad they are, we already have one. North Korea. Hey, you're against free speech? What is this, North Korea? Hey, you don't like taxation? Why don't you move to North Korea? Hey, you know what country doesn't allow its citizens to use YouTube and therefore none of them can respond to this video?